I'm Howard Hu, the Chair of Population Public Health Sciences. Welcome to this next grand rounds. Our Professor Sophia Gruskin, the Director of the Institute for Inequalities and Global Health, will be making the introductions. But first I wanted to just say how pleased I am to have our guest here, Dr. Clark. And it turns out we had something in common, which was that we're in Toronto together, or perhaps at different times. And it's so interesting that she's here at this intersection of publishing, COVID, and health equity. And I just want to finish up a story I was trying to tell you, Dr. Clark, which said I was there to help commission the new public health school, which actually had existed in the 1950s and then got disbanded in the 1970s when a intrepid journalist from the Canadian Public Health Association discovered that the real reason the school was disbanded is because the president of the university and the dean of the medical school at the time figured that this was a hotbed of social radicals and they had to be dealt with, they had to be dispersed. So when I had the pleasure of bringing the school out of the medical school to be its own faculty, as they call it in Canada, I had the opportunity to give a little speech to the governing board, and the second thing I said was, guess what, the social radicals are back. So without further ado, let me welcome Sophia to give introductions.
Well, thanks for that, social radicals that we all are. So it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's dialogue, Improving Equity in Global Health and Overcoming the Perversity of Pandemic Publishing. I love that title, I gotta say. All right, so a special thank you to the department and a special thank you, Howard, to you for us being able to do this together. Why I'm excited about this is that we don't often hear from editors, and we often don't hear from those in editorial spaces in our academic spaces. But I think all of us know that editors really have an incredible power to shape the academic discourse. And I have to say, even before I knew her as a person, Dr. Clark, I knew who you were because I knew you were using your role in amazing ways. You were focusing on inclusivity, on centering expert knowledge from around the world and really opening space for equity and other issues that aren't usually front and center to our field. And so I really have always appreciated that, even before I got to know you as a human being. So I want to say as well that I'm incredibly grateful for her work, but I'm also really grateful that you're with us today and that you're going to share some of your reflections. And it's from a vantage point I think that we don't often get to hear. So the way that it's going to work is this, is that we're going to start with a 45-minute presentation, and then we'll move into a round of reflections and comments from our three respondents, Shanita Hughes-Hilbert, who's there, Jill Johnson, who's there, and Jonathan Cohen, who is there. You are all stars in your own right, but you're well known to this audience, so I hope you'll forgive me if I don't give you full-on introductions, okay, if that's okay. But their bios can be found on the website, so, and I'm hoping that when you give your reflections that you'll give just a few minutes on who you are in terms of the work that you do, in terms of how you do this. And then Dr. Clark, what we'll do is we'll give you an opportunity to respond and then take questions from the audience in the larger discussion. So let me now introduce, if I may, Dr. Jocalyn Clark. She is an award-winning public health scientist and journalist, and she is one of the world's most experienced medical journal editors. She spent more than 20 years at the BMJ, at the Lancet, and at PLOS Medicine. And, you know, I said it before, but I really want to say it again. Her editorial leadership has really helped globalize and diversify the top medical journals, and we really owe her a debt of gratitude for that. She was appointed international editor of the BMJ in August of 2022. And then she rejoined the journal 20 years after having started her editorial career with them, which is kind of amazing. And she came after having directly served as the executive editor at the Lancet between 2016 and 2022. There's a lot in her bio. I'm just going to pull out a couple of things. She's an advisor to Global Health 50/50 and Women Lift Health, and she's a co-founder of the Canadian Women in Global Health. She's an adjunct professor of medicine at the University of Toronto and an honorary associate professor at the Institute for Global Health at the University College of London. And in 2019, she was elected into fellowship at the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh and the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, both in recognition of her scholarship and her leadership in advancing gender equity, the social and political context of health, and medical publishing. And with that, I'd say thank you for being with us, Dr. Clark. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Oh, well, thank you. That was very kind. I hope everyone can hear me okay, and that you can, and that you can also see me okay behind this podium. I am so grateful for the invitation, and actually the pleasure is all mine, so thank you. Because as a professional journal editor, it might be true that you rarely get to come into human contact with this species. I too feel like it's such a pleasure and a privilege to be able to talk to jobbing researchers, people who are working in the fields that we really care about as big medical journals, learn about what you're doing, and I'm very, very interested in engaging with you today as I talk about my career over the last 20 years and the three things that I care very, very much about, most about. The things that I care about the most. Medical journals, we'll talk today about what they're for, why they matter. The trend over the course of my career, which is an increasing globalization, both of research and of these big medical journals, and our one big problem, which, spoiler alert, and the reason why I'm here to talk to all of you wonderful people, is inequalities, and to talk about some of the solutions. I want to look at that in particular from the lens of gender equity, which is my substantive area in my own lived experience, and to tell you about a project that I was funded for and completed in between my tenures at the Lancet and the BMJ on the perversity of pandemic publishing. And if there's time at the end, I want to give you some information about the BMJ's new international strategy and get your feedback. In terms of disclosures, I don't have any financial disclosures, but as Professor Greston mentioned, I've spent over 20 years at major medical journals. So I will, in many respects, be talking from a personal capacity until I start talking about the BMJ strategy, for which I'll be representing the journal that I just joined. I'm really active in editorial professional associations and in improving the quality and integrity of the literature. I've just completed a 6-year term as chair of the Canadian Medical Association journal, its governance council. And if that doesn't give you enough clues, I am a Canadian national. I am not American, which is something that maybe a disclosure that doesn't have as much meaning for you, but when I work internationally, somehow people always assume I'm American instead of Canadian, and us Canadians are very sensitive. And Howard's just stepped out of the room, but it really was very wonderful first to realize that he and I had sort of crossed paths at the public health school in Toronto where I trained, but then also to be called a social radical is very cool. I've been, of course, called much worse. Partly because, this is sort of my life and possibly this talk in a nutshell. This was the life of a professional journal editor before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and it remains so. So that's my way of saying to you, it is a great privilege to do this job. It's not without its challenge, but what I'm going to be talking about to you today is the world of medical journals that is represented by this image, this sort of atmosphere of the top medical journals that have enormous profile and visibility and power and privilege. And certainly doing the job that I do, and even despite all the barriers to try to change powerful journals, a great privilege for me to be a part of this world. But at the same time, one of my strong contentions will be that this world of medical journals has enormous responsibility, not least to redress some of the inequities that I'm going to be talking to you about today. So why do journals matter? Maybe I could ask some of you who are in the room today why you came today, why journals matter.
Dissemination of new knowledge.
Yeah, dissemination of new knowledge. Why else are journals curious or of interest to you, particularly from the point of view of an Institute of Inequalities? Okay, I'll get you talking in a few minutes. I understand you're having your lunch and I've put you on the spot. But here's something I thought you would find interesting. Actually, the very first English language medical journal that was devoted to medicine was published way back in 1684. I love the title of this journal. I find this very charming to a certain degree. But does anyone notice anything about this title that is particularly noteworthy for our topic today? I mean, other than it's remarkably interdisciplinary, isn't it, for a medical journal? Yes?
There's like a sense of othering. Yeah.
Okay, a sense of othering. Oh, interesting. We're going to go there quickly. Yes, let's go there. Actually, the reason why I chose this image to share with you is, isn't this remarkable that the first medical journal had in its title explicitly an interest in research and content, one presumes, from other parts of the world. Of course, since then, and in particular, the big medical journals have been publishing, you may not realize, for almost 200 years. So those big, high-impact medical journals that I'm going to focus my talk on today have been publishing since the Lancet, for example, since 1823. A major milestone in this history was the establishment in 2004 of a mission-driven company called the Public Library of Science, which you may know because it was established in California and San Francisco. I worked for them for a number of years. And that really did intend to disrupt the medical publishing system. Since then, 30,000 journals and probably many more since I wrote this slide a few months ago and counting. Worth remembering that the original role or function of journals was in these four aspects. First, to allow scientists and researchers to have their work registered, to establish, if you can imagine, the mere existence of that work, established, we sometimes say, primacy, to certify it, to control quality, because these journals from the early days did have some form of peer or editorial review. As our colleague said in the audience, even back then, hundreds of years, dissemination was a key role of journals. And of course, preservation, a way to, effectively establish the scientific record. Since then, of course, over many decades, if not centuries, and particularly with the advent of the internet, there are other tools to allow for all of these functions that journals have played. If we had really got you talking, you would have eventually got to this last role and function of journals, which often is the center of people's academic lives, which is publication in journals is a key form of evaluation. That your institutions, your research cultures have developed, and we often call it, don't we, a publish or perish culture, such that people joke about this, but I know it's very painful for people who work within the academy, the extent to which publication in journals, despite all that technology that allows you to establish those other functions, the way in which journal publications are a central currency within your careers. And this is why journals remain really important and really centered and in many ways very powerful. I love this quote. I think it says a lot, that the scientific article is indeed the only way that science is systematically represented in the world. So second, why is global health relevant when we talk about medical journals and publishing? I mean, principally, it's because of the enormous growth in the enterprise of global health. So whatever way you look at it, from the point of view of, our visibility now, no matter where you live in the world, due to media, we see health problems around the world in ways that we never used to. The explosion of scientific capacity and research output from countries other than America or Western Europe. Students and academic programs, there's been a massive spike in interest from students. I've read that 75% of medical schools have programs on global health because of the interest of students. And this sense that we are collectively responsible for the world's health problems. These aren't just the problems of individual nations or regions. It's grown certainly in prominence on the world's political agenda, certainly in the last few years because of the disease pandemic that engulfed the planet. And so too has coverage in medical journals. At the same time, this has given rise to this whole new specialty, if you will. We often think about the world of medical journals as there's some journals, which I'll come to in a minute, that are general medical journals, like the BMJ, where I work now, and versus specialist journals. And here, the rise in interest in global health has formed a whole new specialty, a whole range now of journals available to people wishing to publish global health work, taking different angles. I mean, incredible source of information, research, commentary, certainly that I have enjoyed learning from. But it's this atmosphere, again, that I'm wishing to focus on. On the left, for those of you who have publishing careers and are familiar with the world of general medical journals, probably the journals on the left-hand side of the screen, which are the more British affiliated journals, the ones that I've worked for, tend to have a reputation for being more political, being more journalistic. These are often talked about as campaigning journals. And they actually have a very long history of being interested in health in a global context. But even the journals on the right, so for those of you who are based in America, particularly clinical researchers, for whom these would be the pinnacle, the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, these two in recent years have really begun to globalize their content. What's characteristic about these big journals is that they're often considered to have high impact. They're sometimes called elite medical journals. They are among the most influential media in the world. When you pick up the LA Times or the Guardian, or John lives in New York, the New York Times, and you see a science or health story on the front page of your newspaper, it's often because a piece of research or a piece of commentary has appeared in one of these medical journals and is being reported more widely. But these journals themselves circulate widely. We publish, we're so-called weekly medical journals, but of course, in the internet age, we publish continuously, literally every day. And they're considered to have impact on discourses and agendas, on health policy, on clinical practice, on people's reputations, their profile. And what's interesting, actually I have a copy of the journal. Recognizing that no one reads medical journals in print anymore, I don't even read it. But I brought one because there's a project that I worked on that is on the cover of one of the issues that is really kind of cool and exciting. But if you were to read a print journal, or read it online, as most of medical journal readers do now, you'll see that they're not just research. They're a mix of science and opinion. They almost look like magazines. And together, these journals also exist in a very competitive market, both commercially for advertisers and subscribers, but also a competitive market for research. So why do you think I'm here? I'm here, of course, because I love meeting students and I love, having time interacting with real researchers. But at the end of the day, I'm interested in you bringing your best research to the BMJ rather than one of the competitors, the Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, etc. Edited by professional editors, by which I mean not volunteer academics who have a day job and suffer under the pressure of trying to do peer review and edit journals for which they have very little training and very little compensation, but edited by professional editors who do this for a living. Most of us are trained clinically or scientifically. Many are journalists, but this is our full-time job. And as my opening image conveyed, these big journals are rejection machines, by which I mean, I don't mean that pejoratively, although I know it can be painful when you're at the sharp end of a decision letter that rejects your work, but there's enormous competition for space simply because we receive so much more than we can possibly publish. And that means, of course, I should say as an aside, rejecting much very, very worthy research. You simply don't have time. So what's the problem? So this is the problem. I think this map, which is from worldmapper.org, is probably one that's familiar to you because I think many of you, at least in the room, perhaps online as well, are interested in inequalities. So this is a map that converts population against where research output is to demonstrate the extent to which there is global inequality in the production of knowledge. I could almost have called this, probably this slide, in the publication of knowledge, such that most of the world's knowledge and publication of knowledge comes from, let's call it the global north, despite much of the global majority living in the global south. And we know about how poorly distributed the abundance of the world's resources are, because if we didn't before, of course, we would have during COVID, didn't we? Because this map, which shows the perverse vaccine inequity around the world, showed the abundance of availability of vaccine dose and how poorly it was distributed. And that is one of the most important challenges and very legitimate challenges for all of us who work within the global health community. Journals are just one part of that community, which I'll come to in a minute. And it's been a long time, in fact, that these inequities have been problematized. There's a lot of recent literature and commentary, including in my own journal, about what's wrong with global health. But I found it really interesting to be reminded about this really wonderful piece by Richard Horton 10 years ago this year, in which he described how global health was being co-opted to serve the interests of the already privileged. It's worth reading this, recognizing it's a decade old, The Case Against Global Health. But more and more, we're beginning to understand the profound paradox of global health, and captured really nicely in a piece by my colleagues Shay Abimbola and Madhu Pai in the Lancet a couple of years ago, that global health is a contradiction in itself because it intends to try to reduce or eliminate inequalities, but itself is deeply rooted in a variety of forms of supremacy. And Madhu, in particular, a fellow Canadian, he's at McGill University, shows this nice little graphic. I'm gonna build on this, that the default settings in global health are northern, white, male, and that imbues a lot of power and privilege. So I want to go a little deeper to trace for you what, from my view, is the nature of the problem, because it's one thing to describe these issues, it's another to understand all of our collective roles in it. And I want to do it, as I said from the beginning, through the lens of gender inequity, which is the area that I know most about. And the first problem in all of these inequities, which gender and feminist theories in health that support my gender equity work allow us to see, which is that there has been a very long-standing record of evidence to show that there are disparities in a variety of elements of one's life and career that disadvantage women and favor men, such that those 50% of undergraduates who are women, those 50% of medical students in this country, in my native country, in Britain, and most of the world, that all of the aspirations and dreams and the rights that women, young women have when they enter this profession are steadily eroded, such that we have a very, very small number of senior health leaders who are women. And that's, of course, not because there's any evidence of unequal ability between men and women, but that there's lots of evidence of what we would call structured bias, gender bias within a system that then doesn't create a level playing field for anyone to aspire or advance their career goals, but that playing field is very unequal. And worse is evidence of cumulative advantage. And this is a very nice, very simple line graph from a piece of work we published in a theme issue we did in the Lancet just before the pandemic on basically gender equality, that showed that two people, in this case, they called them John and Jane, so a man and a woman who had an equally phenomenal scientific or research idea at the beginning of their careers. But the level of gender bias, which had been found in this massive, massive study within a funding agency that showed that men had a 1.4 times advantage against women, adjusting for age and the type of research, that the likelihood of John getting that grant earlier in his career then allowed the leg up, if you will, for subsequent rounds, such that over the course of one's career, that advantage compounds to men and that disadvantage compounds to women. So the important point here is that this is a system. This is not an individualized problem. And secondly, that it's constructed. So what does it mean when something's a social construction? It means that it's made up and we can make a different system. And it's been set up and built and over time such that it rewards the already privileged and powerful. And the third piece about the nature of the problem, from my point of view, is that we're all in this together. So I think it's rather common for people to look to journals to do a certain amount of gatekeeping when it comes to trying to redress this uneven playing field, or at least the unequal representation that we see in the pages of journals. And it's also easy to look at academic institutions to say, when are you going to get your house in order to supply us a more diverse pool of talent from which we can draw our health leaders and draw our authors? And it's also very easy and legitimate to say to funders, what on earth are you doing by allowing a system of bias that spits out at the end people who haven't experienced the same levels of opportunity or access? And I'm dwelling on this because it is unusual for people to spend time to develop. I mean, this is a very simple theory of change, but I want to be clear about the ways in which the evidence shows advantage and disadvantage can be expressed. And please let me be clear that I acknowledge intersectional forms of both diversity and disadvantage, but I speak from the point of view of gender equity because it's my substantive area. So this is the theory of change that we used in this theme issue that I described a few minutes ago at the Lancet, where we really started as a journal to start looking at ourselves and our role in it. But you'll see how journals and editors have one part to play within this ecosystem. And of course, if you see yourself in this theory of change, in one part of it, that makes you part of the whole problem. Also makes you have to take responsibility for the solutions. But when women, let's say, or minoritized groups, people from racialized groups, for example, are underrepresented as peer reviewers, as authors, they then accrue fewer publications. They then are less competitive when it comes to funding and awards. If they get fewer funding and awards, they have less easy path to promotion and advancement, and then they have poorer representation within universities, which then makes the work of journal editors to try to surface a more diverse pool of experts. Of course, we know what they're out there, but if they're not at those top levels for us to utilize them, then that whole vicious cycle starts again. This is how it works. And it's really important that we all recognize our role within this, and that we can't be, I'll take your question when I'm finished talking, thanks. The issue is that, as many of you will recall, the recognition of, let's call it the EDI problem, was growing. We were beginning to have these conversations. It was even in the mainstream that within health and science, we were creating environments that couldn't be characterized as a level playing field. And it's characterized a little bit by, and I know this is simplistic, but progress was being made with certain parts of that ecosystem taking responsibility, making changes, whether that was HR or legislative or targets, quotas, etc. And then of course, COVID changed everything. And so I'm going to spend about 5 or 10 minutes telling you what it was like as a journal editor during a pandemic, and how this has basically engulfed, swallowed up all those gains we were beginning to make, and why this is a problem now, at a time when people want to recover from the pandemic, and I get that, and want to believe that we are in a recovery period, or that we want to put it all behind us. That the backsliding that occurred, particularly for women of color, women from low and middle income countries, that occurred during COVID, are going to have long-term implications that we mustn't ignore. First of all, you may know this, but it's extraordinary that COVID, in the first year of COVID, 2020, 1.5 million articles were added to the scientific literature. That's published articles, the most ever in history. This is data from my colleague, Vincent Lerivière at the University of Montreal. Of course, this translated to a massive spike in submissions at big journals almost immediately in around the third week of January and continuing. For medical journals, remember I posted early in my talk about the role that we felt we had as editors to disseminate knowledge. Well, this really made us rethink what that role and responsibility was. So the kind of pressure and expectation and responsibility was such that we had never felt before. That if we made mistakes as journal editors, we actually could shape the course of the pandemic response. It's Richard Horton being quoted in the New York Times. And in audience and scrutiny. Even the big medical journals mostly were read by informed other researchers and scientists, but the pandemic meant, you probably, well, not this crowd, but maybe some of your extended family members who don't work in research, all of a sudden the Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine became household names, didn't they? You were seeing editors and researchers and titles of journals on, the nightly news. I mean, that kind of audience spread was massive. And then also, of course, the scrutiny that came with it. Huge amount, let's call it noise to signal. That is what happens when you get 4 or 5 times the volume of submissions or the volume of research output. There was early on, I mean, like within weeks, if not a couple of months early in the pandemic, about waste. Stuff being done too quickly, not reproducible, too small, etc. And leading some people to call this a man-made tsunami of garbage science. And I'm going to dwell on that for a minute and pick on this guy, but he deserves it. Of course, this is not a real human. This is a stock image that, you know, I paid for it. Probably should have given it proper credit. But this dude was the bane of the problem that I'm trying to outline to you, for which we're going to talk about your institutional responsibilities as well as mine. So just let me pull out a couple things. This is a man, a white man. Look, so he's in a beautiful kitchen, is he not? It's very clean. He's got his espresso. He's got his iPhone with his headphones, so he's just gone for a run. This is the individual who is protected from the burdens of lockdown. Maybe had someone clean his house, maybe had someone looking after the children, maybe didn't have to worry about elderly parents or his junior colleagues. Guess what he did? What's he doing right now on that laptop? What do you reckon he's doing? He is writing commentaries and sending them. Thank you, John. You knew where I was going with this. Writing commentaries, writing papers. This is called privilege of choice. And this became really evident really quickly. Not, you know, don't have to take it from me, who was reading hundreds of papers with my colleagues and working 7 days a week for most of, at least the first couple of years of the pandemic. It was really immediately obvious that those lockdowns were brutally hitting women more than they were men. Professional women here is what I'm talking about, because the endpoint here is publication output. And it was clear that disproportionately, those burdens that came with those lockdowns and schools closing were being shouldered by women. I wrote a piece in the Lancet this week, actually this week's Lancet, and I revisited, this is a little quote, I revisited a report that your national academies had put out. This is astonishing. So for those of you who are faculty members in science and medicine, 90% of the female faculty members said that they did most of their children's school and childcare demands, and just 9% reported sharing those duties with a spouse. So that's extraordinary. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what that led me to investigate a little bit further, but I want to be really clear. Most of the, let's call it momentum and output, was because people wanted to help. People were desperate to try to do something. Do you remember those early days? Both editors, publishers, and researchers trying to help. And that is often seen as a real triumph, that we did it together. It included people migrating from their own expertise, in fact, and also to recover your publication losses, knowing that your operating theaters, laboratories, etc. were closed. But at the same time, much publishing is opportunistic. We know that already. And what I was observing, and many others were as well, is that we were invisibilizing women's expertise, and that the opportunism was vastly advantaging men's output during the pandemic. And of course, that was limiting not just women's careers, but the diversity of perspective. So I was very, very fortunate to get a small fellowship from the Brochet Foundation in Switzerland, and I wrote 3 papers, one of which was published in the BMJ, and I invite you to look at. But I just want to trace through some of the reporting I did and some of the original bibliometric analysis I did to arrive at some actions that we need to take as institutions. The first is that indeed submissions were up about 60%, but then journal editors halved their publication speeds. So it wasn't long before people started to worry about, what about quality? What about trust? You're getting more submissions, you certainly don't have more staff taking care of them, and you're taking decisions super fast. Like, what's that doing to the quality, the reproducibility, the trust? The other thing that happened is that there was very unusual citation behavior when it came to COVID papers. I'll talk about that in a minute. But citations are incredibly important because that's how you accumulate capital. So it's one thing to have a publication, but as your citations accrue, you're generating visibility to your work, recognition for your work, and what's effectively considered publication impact. Equally, the big journals accumulated COVID capital because of this focus on what some people call the COVIDization. And the big medical journals, in fact, doubled their impact factor. So does everyone know what an impact factor is? It's kind of a measure of, I mean, technically speaking, it's a measure of the citation impact of the work that you publish, but it's also considered like it's like a mark of prestige, and journals tend to rank themselves, or they are ranked by impact factor, and the big journals doubled their impact factors on the basis of all that COVID publishing. But it turns out that this was a winning formula for men. The bibliometric data show that women's first authoring of papers fell almost by a half. That of the most prolific COVID authors, just 10% of them were women. That COVID papers got 20 times more citations than non-COVID papers during the pandemic. And this extended to other forms of media where very few women were quoted in newspapers and used as scientific experts. When I looked at this more closely, these are all public data. When I looked across the big medical journals for my project, I discovered that in the big elite medical journals, now remember, all of these big medical journals have EDI commitments, public commitments that they've made, promises they've made to the community to try to be a part of change. That in the BMJ and the Lancet, 9 out of 10 of those most prolific authors were men. And the bottom graph is those 10 authors in the BMJ during the pandemic period. The most prolific author, can you imagine writing 62 articles during the pandemic period? Of those 10, just 1 was a woman. All these people are household names, by the way. You can ask me after who they are, but it's public information. And just 1 person of color among those groups. So this is disappointing. And this, again, that quote from my colleague, Vincent Lariviere, everyone had to have their COVID moment, but it was men who had the privilege of choice. Others have done, it's much harder to do bibliometric analyses by race or ethnicity because we don't have classification systems and international consensus about what those data are in the way that we do have binary sex or gender. But some people, it's a really interesting article, I believe by a group of researchers at the University of Toronto, to show the extent to which what had been a growing diversity in authors in the New England Journal and JAMA had over time become much less so. And others are doing work on the geography of COVID publications. So let's talk about some solutions in my last few minutes, and then I hope this might be of interest to the discussants about how we might understand our responsibilities and how you might recognize that these harms are major. This exclusion, even as women's productivity recovers, will have a negative impact on careers, on the knowledge base, and on future research questions. And that's because really simple fixes like stopping the tenure clock or COVID, some institutions call them COVID impact policies, those are just not really a panacea because they're just going to delay promotion. They're not going to increase the chance of it ever happening. Secondly, there is very strong evidence, and there has been for a long time, that a diverse, a woman, a person from a racialized group, a diverse team, they ask different questions. So a diverse team makes for a more diverse research question and in fact, a more robust research study. That has been established. So having had that exclusion during a COVID period means that we need to find a way to recover those losses. And it's not easy, there are different levels of responsibility, but everyone has a role to play. And remember, I gave you this kind of simple little picture to try to convey the point that this system is interdependent, that it is an ecosystem that we all contribute to and therefore all have responsibility for. So, I mean, some of the things when I reported these studies and talked to a lot of experts, they say funders and universities, firstly, really need to elevate those topics that have been lost. There are ways, proved ways, that you can reduce bias in assessments, including making automatic adjustments. I can talk about that a bit more. Universities really need to be just rethinking their strategies, including flexible working, because in-person time favors men. Networking, FaceTime, securing promotions, childcare support, more egalitarian, let's say, norms within institutions and obviously within broader society are going to be really important. And de-linking publication to evaluation and advancement, I know is a huge question mark and challenge, but probably needs to be done. I'll speed up. What journals can do. All these roles of journals existed before the pandemic, but we need to be doubling down on them to try to recover some of the, I think, good work that we're trying to do. Many people have called for journals to publish more bravely and to campaign for change. And I mean, I see this work being done. There's been more change in the last 5 years of my career than there had been in the first 15. And theme issues that are both about surfacing the substantive issues. These are two theme issues on race in medicine, but also how journals look to themselves as being part of that problem, I think is to be encouraged. Obviously for you to judge, not for me, because I've been a part of them. Encouraging equitable collaborations and authorship. There are new standards for how we work together internationally, and these are things that journals should be considering making more mandatory, including diversity and inclusion reporting. And I say require here because actually many of these guidelines have existed for a long time. It's just that there hasn't been great compliance with them, either on the author side or on the journal side, and that needs to be improved. And exercising positive action. Positive action is a term that we use in the UK because it's not legal to have affirmative action. But affirmative action is effectively, in this context, going out to new diverse pools of experts. They're out there. It's not like they don't exist. You're not lowering your standards, but you're giving more attention to groups that you want to promote and elevate and whose perspectives you want to be represented in the literature. Because otherwise just going along and doing what the Academy supplies for you or what funders are supporting is meaning that as journal editors we're just simply contributing to the inequalities we wish to redress. And I'll show you how sensitive this can be. When you leave it to the unsolicited stuff, so these are submissions that just come into us. We don't commission things like research and letters. That's still about 75% men. But if you exercise positive action, as we did on my team at the Lancet, you can, over time, increase the number of women authors who lead commissioned content. And I was very happy with one of my colleagues at the BMJ just last week actually showed me that we have almost 50-50 gender balance on editorials in the BMJ, which makes me happy. And finally, before I finish, really importantly for journal editors is learning from colleagues, particularly colleagues including Madhu Pai, who I just mentioned a few minutes ago, who gives a wonderful talk on global health editors as allies. The importance in not just being an ally, which is becoming a bit of a buzzword, but engaging in critical allyship, which involves very deep, stepping back, educating ourselves, learning about the structures around us to which we contribute to, and recognizing the ways in which critical allyship is important. And the other piece around that is that I have found very useful, and I wish to credit here, is this wonderful piece of work by Stephanie Nixon, again, Canadian, I can't help myself, but she's done a really interesting model called the coin model of privilege. And it's a concrete way of taking some of the anti-oppression, anti-racist, intersectional ideas and flipping them so that you can be self-reflexive and think about your own role. So I'm gonna stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm just gonna leave this slide up because I want people to have a look at our new podcast.
Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Shane Halbert. I'm Vice Chair for Research here in the department and also Professor in the Division of Health Behavior Research. I'm also Associate Director for Cancer Health Equity at the Memorial Comprehensive Cancer Center. So thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. It really took me through like the course of my whole career.
Yeah.
But I'm also a researcher, so I'm a behavioral scientist, and my research focuses on minority health and health disparities. So I come today, and my comments really reflect my experience just completing maybe a 7 or 8 year tenure as a senior editor for Cancer Epidemiology Journal. I also come as a consumer of science and really have paid attention to the efforts that have been implemented most recently around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and some of the strategies that the journal that I was serving as a senior editor for, and I think that other journals have taken to sort of respond to the racial and just other types of disparities that were really brought to the forefront of our national attention during the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the things that struck me about the efforts is that, there's now these like the diversity, equity, and inclusion sort of sections of the journals that I think are designed to bring attention to the sort of the content and the science that's being done in across different fields. And it's interesting to me because as I look at the titles of the publications and but I'm like, who's publishing that work? Who are the first and senior authors on that work? And, I do think that that's one of the areas where I still have considerable concern, because I think that even in the field, in my field, minority health and health disparities, many of the individuals who are sort of recognized as the leaders are not from racial and ethnic minority groups. They are, and I'll share with you a personal example. So I started my career doing research on decision-making about genetic testing for inherited breast cancer risk, and I focus only on African-American women. And so the sort of randomized trial, like the gold standard of studies. And, as we went to publish our work, the critique from each sort of started with the holy grail of clinical research medical journals, JAMA. Got a very quick rejection from JAMA, but a colleague of mine sort of published the same paper and same type of paper, and I think she had maybe 15 Black women in her study, which was really, powerful, because then it became the sort of the top-cited paper as it related to this particular domain. So when I sat on study sections, was the chair of the study section, so I was reading all of the grants that were coming in, and this paper was like cited as like, this is the work on decision making about genetic testing in African American women. And it was really fascinating because we had, we finally got our paper published in Genetics and Medicine, which is much more tiered. But it really sort of brought home the I guess, sort of the experiences and, how journals, and I don't think I quite understood that journals like JAMA and the New Journal of Medicine have professional editors. I mean, I think that's a really big aha moment for me, even at this stage, because I sort of have been in the peer review process. Like I said, I've served as a student editor. So it's a very different perspective, but it also, brought to bear, I guess, one of the things that was so fascinating is that, well, in the area of racial disparities, something you don't have a like comparison. And that wasn't the goal of my own research. So a couple of things I learned perseverance, and that, every paper has a home. I mean, and it's really the breadth and impact of the science. So it feels a little bit rambly, but I think it's, one of the things that really resonated with your presentation for me is that, publication is so important because it achieves many different things for us as a society. It is a way of disseminating and communicating knowledge to the public. Whose work is being published in the leading journals, and all journals, and I think the leading journals are the ones that we are the most familiar with. It becomes what we come to understand about a particular topic and area. So when there's lack of diversity and lack of inclusion of individuals who are sort of doing the work and doing the science from the lived experience, it really does shape and inform sort of what we believe and what we understand about any particular topic. So I think my sort of take-home point before I pass it on is to say I really do appreciate all that you said, and it really is an important area for us to think about. The last thing I'll say before I really pass it on is that I think there's more work that needs to be done to understand how we can really impact the diversity, equity, and inclusion among the published work in the peer review process. I think that we absolutely need a way to understand who is publishing, who's leading the work, who's publishing it, and really take that into account as we understand the context of our science for diversity. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Jill, do you mind if I turn to you?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for that talk. It was really sort of wonderful to kind of hear from an editor, right? Like thinking through these really systems of oppression, kind of like personally, on a daily basis, but also a lot of the work that we do with the community, how we work with. So my name is Jill Johnston. I'm an associate professor of environmental health. And my work really centers around community-based participatory research and environmental racism. And my kind of trajectory into academia came out of community organizing. I'm from the south side of San Antonio and dealt with a lot of pollution issues there. Learned about kind of pollution and contamination from that lived experience. And then eventually kind of went into academia through doing environmental engineering. So a very kind of technical degree that I combine with kind of this community-based work. I think in those two disciplines, right, you really see a lot of gendered impact of the work, where doing the STEM research, right, the engineering is held at a different level of prestige than doing community-based work. And when you try to sort of take those methods, take those skills, and put it into a community setting, I think kind of automatically some of that work is really devalued, sort of both within our academic institutions, but then also as we sort of put it into publications or seeking funding for that. And I think that we really, right, lose, as you kind of pointed out, some of these important aspects of research and knowledge because of who's being studied or not being studied. And your work really reminded me of my kind of mentor, Dr. Steve Lang, who wrote a paper called Who's Epidemiology, Who's Health. It's about 25 years old now, but really commented on this fact that at least in the epidemiology field, a lot of it's based on kind of working white men as who is being studied, and that kind of leads to huge swaths of population. And sort of then, when thinking about that in the context of journals, like one thing that brought to mind when thinking through solutions is, I think a lot, there's this need or this statement that science should be generalizable. And I think what that does is really invisibilizes, like, right, these either community-based struggles, struggles of specific, marginalized and disadvantaged groups, because there's like, this is a problem to that community or to that specific group of people, and so it's not of interest to the rest of the population. And so I think that type of mentality I've often like confronted, right, with response to some of our work that's working like in a rural population near the border. It's like, well, that's not generalizable to the rest of the world. It's like, should that really be the goal, right? Or is kind of understanding this, in my case, like how this type of pollution is impacting community health, like is that enough for our science? I think, now, or like, I'm kind of thinking through navigating these spaces where there's kind of work to, right, I think try to uplift more diverse voices, but kind of balancing, right, that extractive, I think one of your last slides like pointed out, just different words, but like kind of this extractive-based approach to sort of taking that knowledge versus one of like an empowerment kind of based one that's really like uplifting these voices. That's why I think that is really sort of important to highlight, and we did that as we think through, right, how we can design better systems to address this. I have one last point that I'm losing now, but I mean, I think when we went back to talking about the pandemic and all the different impacts, and and I think one thing I'm contending with now is just that lost research, like when working with these communities, right, the focus, right, people were trying to survive in all sorts of different ways. And so, many of the studies that we have designed had to pivot, had to go on pause, and sort of building back from that is really kind of needs that potential to really start over, but kind of we're in a new space and a new reality. And I think sometimes we have to really shift the paradigm in which we were doing research to really acknowledge that and really be responsive to some of these sort of real hopeful elements. Yes. Thank you. Please.
Thank you. So I speak very quietly, so if you can't hear me, I'll go over the mic. Thanks, Sophia. Thanks, Dr. Clark. This has been a real privilege. Your presentation, my job will come in faculty department. Your work really brings together two of my passions, one of them being global health and another being diversity, equity, and inclusion. In addition to being faculty here, I also have the privilege of working with Shanita, Howard, and others on a number of terms of racial justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. And indeed, during the pandemic, when that period, that perverse spike in publishing was occurring, in addition to leading a global health program for a major international philanthropy, I was also leading internal diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at the foundation. So this all resonates incredibly powerfully. I think it leaves me with a lot of questions. I think the main question that it leaves me with is whether this highly inequitable spike in publishing not only occasioned during the pandemic lockdown, not only robbed women of career opportunities, but also robbed society of a perspective on pandemic governance that we so desperately needed at the time. And I pose that question with awareness of the hazards of essentializing pandemic governance according to gender, right? And people have asked the question, I mean, do women lead pandemic responses differently than men? And without falling into the trap of gender stereotyping, I think if you believe that diversity is not only important for ethical and professional reasons, but also for pragmatic reasons, but also, important for public health itself, and it's important to ask that question, and you yourself cite evidence that diverse research teams ask better research questions, contribute to a richer knowledge base, etc. Your talk reminded me of some literature that came out early in the pandemic, which you must be very familiar with, that actually asked the question of whether you could correlate pandemic outcomes in that unforgettable first quarter of the pandemic to the gender of political leaders. It's very difficult research to do, in part because of the very small sample size of female-led countries, but nevertheless, one study did find what they argued was a statistically significant correlation, and essentially this study mapped pandemic cases and deaths in the first quarter against the gender of the political leader, found I think somewhere like double the number of cases and deaths in male-led countries. And to address some of the methodological challenges, they also, as you probably remember, compared comparable and neighboring countries, and again found better outcomes, at least during that period, and with the available data in countries that were led by women. And of course, asked the question, why? And the main answer these authors gave was that almost by and large, women leaders imposed lockdowns sooner. And then the question became, well, why did they? And then the authors go into what I think is probably a quite controversial literature about female leadership styles, right? And looking at things like risk aversion, or empathy, or deliberation, and this is their work, not mine, as female leadership traits and how that might govern pandemic responses, which is, I think, an interesting set of questions. Now, I don't know whether, if those gender differences exist and are significant, whether they've found their way into research questions, into pandemic publishing. But what I do know is that, or at least what many of us argued at the time, is that we were so deprived during those early days of COVID-19 of what we can characterize, if not as a female leadership style, and I think what we can fairly characterize as a feminist leadership style. And I remember colleagues of mine and I at the Society Foundations really trying to articulate what a feminist pandemic governance would look like. And some of the characteristics that we were interested in were the way in which, again, men and women can both be feminists. It doesn't have to essentialize according to gender, but certain qualities of what we could describe as a kind of patriarchal, paternalistic form of pandemic governance included things like, succumbing to narratives of scarcity, right? That, we'll give away our vaccines if we have enough left to give away, right? As opposed to embracing narratives of abundance that insist that there's enough to go around for everyone, assuming you get to the root causes of so-called scarcity in the first place. Or, the difference between succumbing to false choices versus rejecting false binaries, right? So the ultimate false binary during the lockdown, which characterized so much pandemic governance, was that we had to choose between our health and our livelihoods, right? Whereas what some have described as a feminist leadership ethic that rejects false choices says it's absolutely not a choice. In fact, livelihoods and economic thriving is precisely what's going to make it possible for people to cope with a lockdown, to obey the behavioral countermeasures, etc. And then, of course, the difference between taking an approach that is rooted in conformity and one size fits all and public health measures that everyone's expected to obey versus an equity approach that recognizes that different people need different things. So I don't know if that literature is relevant to your thinking at all, but it's what came back to me listening to you, and just can't help but ask you and ask everybody here whether again the true cost of this shockingly inequitable boom in publishing was felt not only in the careers of women, but in lives lost during the pandemic.
Thanks. Jocalyn, would you like to respond to what you've heard? And I want to open it up to give everybody an opportunity to ask you questions,
Yeah,
if that's
that'd be
okay.
great. This woman had a question as well, so let's come to you. I'll respond first. So let me take it in reverse order. Yeah, I'm also fascinated by that literature that tries to understand and explain why women's leadership is both important but might be tied to certain hard outcomes. And I mean, I love it. I find it interesting. I have zero interest in essentializing leadership characteristics. I think what feminist and particularly intersectional feminist approaches have taught me and uncovered for me is a recognition that you need a diverse set of qualities to lead teams, to be effective in your job, to care for other people, to recognize the value in other people. And that just as, you know, critical perspectives like intersectional feminist thought allows for women in all their diversity to express themselves and be leaders and flex and pursue their dreams and realize every right that they hold, that they should be able to enjoy every freedom to do that, but equally that men should be able to express themselves in a much broader range of masculinity. So I do love that literature, and I have read it. Of course, I've read that study. But I also know that women leaders, there are several in my native country. I mean, of course, I spent the pandemic in the UK where I live, but in my native country, almost every provincial medical health officer and the federal chief medical officer in Canada was a woman. And they were all just, I guess I can't swear because this is being recorded, but they're all amazing and inspiring and badass. That doesn't count. And they did their jobs effing well, and it was recognized by media, by the public, etc. But they withstood, and many were women of color, to come back to your work, Chanita, experienced the most devastating and destructive toxicity in social media about their appearance. I mean, so you can't win. You're like, damned if you do, damned if you don't. You try to excel as a woman. But these women would have not had a good night's sleep in 2 years. They had their own families to take care of, and they had this enormous responsibility for the public health. This, of course, is true with, Prime Minister Jacinda in New Zealand. It was apparently a reason why she stepped down, just the amount of toxicity that women, particularly women of color, experience. So we need to balance that. And one of the reasons why, John, I think sometimes going down that path, though it's rich in understanding, can be a distraction to the end game, the end goal here, is because it allows that profile of individual, so let's call them the white male, high-income country person, to escape responsibility. It kind of takes heat off the systems that we have allowed to be built around us that let folks like that just skate into position. We have had something happen during COVID, despite the fact that we have had some examples of women leaders. By the way, most of them have stepped down now because they have to put up with so much abuse. We have sort of, what's the word, like concretized this classical notion and construction of what an expert in an emergency looks like. And he looks a hell of a lot like that image I put up with the dude on the top of the mountain in his business suit with the flag, because he owned this pandemic. He was on your television, CNN, ABC, on the BBC every night. He was tapped every time to tell people and the nation what was, happening, so it's kind of like a reversion to old, quite outdated biases about who should be in charge. And what that also did, I think, was really to come to Jill and Chandita, your points about how it then shaped what we thought the priorities ought to be when it came to everyone's focus of their professional lives. So there was maybe, I would love to ask you, what I've read in the literature is a great diversion of funding calls from community-based work, from disparities work, really pivoting toward COVID. That's allowing folks who weren't a particular expert in infectious disease, in EPI, in public health measures during a pandemic governance, allowed folks who didn't have that expertise to nonetheless step into that role of being an expert. So a bit of a push, a bit of a pull set of factors doing that. But what I worry about is that we've come to the end of the line of a 3-year experience. Of course, we're not completely out of the pandemic, but nevertheless, we've allowed these notions of who's the expert in this room to sort of be so prominent that we're leaving all this other expertise on the table. And these are, there's many young people in this room who are younger than you guys who would not know what an expert in an emergency looked like before the pandemic gave such visibility. And so what they're seeing is these types of individuals being what's profiled in order to, convey expertise. And those kinds of social practices, because they're not technical, they're social, that's how kind of norms and expectations get formed. And I worry about that a great deal. And also, let's be honest, in your country, for sure, affirmative action's under siege, like kind of in the university sector, I understand. But those same forces are happening all over the world with the move toward a more populist politics, for example. So my question is, how do we recover some of that momentum we were having around the importance of, I don't even want to call it EDI, because it somehow gets a little bit co-opted, and it becomes sort of like a slogan, but you know what I'm saying, like genuine, thoughtful, brave, Howard represents that as sitting in this room, like, this is institutional change that has to happen, for which there's going to be a lot of resistance, because it's going to require some people to give up a hell of a lot of power and privilege. And that has to happen. And so I guess the question is, how do we get there?
Let's take the question.
There's one on the computer here, but am I reading?
I tried.
Okay, you've waited and waited.
Yeah, I think you already kind of answered it. I guess, I was really shocked by what you shared in terms of like the real impacts of gender bias. And I feel like I certainly agree with the idea that it's a social construct. But I guess I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on the real impacts of women as child bearers, because sharing that responsibility with a significant other once the child is already born, but I guess my question is, there's real time that women are required to take off, if they do choose to have a child, and kind of what you feel institutions' responsibilities and journals' responsibilities are during that period of time, when the woman is pregnant and having a baby, what do you feel their responsibility is in that time period?
Yeah, you're right. Pregnancy is a almost uniquely female experience. The human female gestates a baby for 9 months. But the parenting of a child, the conception of a child, doesn't just involve an individual woman. And certainly I would never suggest ever that we ought not support any professional or any parent, any person wishing to be a parent, with very fair and healthy, labor protections, labor as in work protections, such that people have reasonable maternity and paternity leaves that are legislated so that they're protected. I mean, the US actually is a real outlier in the world. In Canada and Britain, and I'm not so sure about Bangladesh, but those are the 3 countries I've lived in recently. Definitely recognize the importance of there being a step back from professional duties during the early months of a child's life and protect one's job and income. However, I think, what was your name? Kelsey, I think, Kelsey, what we're talking about here is a much larger and wildly disproportionate burden on women to care, not just for children, but for elders and for trainees. I know, a lot of you who are faculty members in this room, probably if you look back, you're probably worried about your postdocs and your students a little bit. Some of them might have been not doing so well during lockdown, might have felt very isolated. And others, so that far exceeds the biological requirement of having a child. It's really tough reading some of the literature on what a brutal hit it was for particularly women with small children that men somehow escaped. This is really interesting. I mean, I don't have children, so for me, the question in my mind, it's so sharp in my mind, like, hold on a second. Like, my husband's in the kitchen, I'm in my office. If there were kids here, why the hell would I be why would I be fixing them on the internet with their homework or whatever? Like, why is it that you wouldn't have shared that? So that's what I mean when I say, when I said during my talk that there's clearly a bigger, broader context. But if we're not trying to create a change, fighting for those supports within institutions, for example, like, why aren't funders giving people a budget line for childcare? Why is it that I keep hearing from my colleagues, female colleagues, that they might not be able to go to the conference that I'm going to because they don't have childcare? Do you see what I mean? Like, why is that not shared between the 2 partners or other family members? So I'm looking for, and I believe everyone in this room would agree, more egalitarianism. And of course, it's not just related to pregnancy. No, I of course take this.
So can I just say, because we're getting close, but I want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity. I'm going to read this question that's online to you. I'm going to add a little bit of my own, but then I'd like to open it up for anybody who wants to ask a question, and then if you all will respond, and then we'll close up if that's okay. So the question is, Judith Green and colleagues published a piece in Critical Public Health titled "Moving On in Uncertain Times, a Goodbye," detailing the mass resignation of the editorial board. They argued that the current model of charging for article processing fees and subscriptions is simply unsustainable. Academics and researchers are struggling to secure the necessary fees to publish their work. They also assert that the system contributes to hardening epistemic inequalities, particularly for authors in wealthier countries without funding sources and those in low-income countries. So based on your experience, what do you believe should be the right move to address these challenges and disparities? And my question to you that I would just add to that is, if you think that anything that has changed now, are things reverting back to how they were? Are things getting worse? Are things getting better? Where are we right now in terms of what you've been seeing in the last few months? And then I just want to open it up to anybody else who has a question.
So who was the person online? Did they identify themselves?
They did, but then I put my glasses back.
Oh, okay.
Hold on. Yes. Okay. Go ahead. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I knew it wasn't you, the author of this.
No.
The piece was Judith. No, I mean, that is a fantastic question and a really important one. And there's a few elements to it. Number one, publication costs. So we mustn't forget that this is, commodity, it involves enormous amount of time and labor. But at the same time, the scientific publishing industry, more broadly, is a massively profitable one. And so it makes sense that there would be a great deal of concern that what is being charged for publishing is a fair level of payment required from authors. One aspect of the answer to that question is to sort of flip it and to ask people to consider that publication is the last step of your research. And many, many funders and institutions now recognize that, and funders themselves will provide the budget line so that the work they're investing in and the work that your human subjects have consented to participate in will have the fruits of that research in the form of a paper that can allow for dissemination of the knowledge to be paid for, so that the publication charge can be paid for. So that's sort of the most elegant and simple answer to the question, is that funders of all research need to, follow the lead of big institutions like NIH, Wellcome, et cetera, who allow for that. What that doesn't answer is the challenge associated with paying for publication of folks who aren't publishing research or aren't funded to do that research. And that's obviously a huge barrier, and it's probably a factor, not a major factor, in some of that sort of geographic divide in the major medical journals, which are dominated by high-income country authors. What I can say is that at all of the publishers I've worked for, there is a commitment to there being no barrier to publishing the journals. And we all have waiver programs such that if you can't pay, if a charge is being levied, which isn't the case in most of the articles anyways, but if you weren't able to pay for something, you would still be able to publish. And editorial decisions are entirely separate from that business team over there that deals with money. But that is kind of like a little bit of a Band-Aid on the broader question, and that is obviously coming from big journals that are very profitable, so they have extra money that they divert into waiver programs to allow for there not to be financial barrier. The other part of the question, which I wish to acknowledge because it's on my mind a lot, and I think we'll talk about it when we're at the conference. There's a big global health conference that Professor Preston and I are both at, and that is, in a very fair system, or in a system I think that we're all wishing we could see, big journals like the ones I work for won't exist. And also, why would you, if you were working in a community-based setting in a country abroad doing amazing stuff, why would you even be interested in publishing in a journal like the ones I work for? Do you see what I'm saying? And I think that it is probably the case that the ideal situation is that we don't have this kind of hierarchy in like the sort of pecking order that we've all discussed. You mentioned the tiers. And nor, I mean, this is for Howard and other colleagues who are responsible for like assessing you for tenure, that it won't matter so much where you publish your work, but the quality of the research or the commentary itself, if you see what I mean. And I think if we get there, which probably won't maybe happen in my lifetime, but if we get there, then those questions of the imbalance won't exist because we'll have overhauled a system that allows for more broad and I think level platforms for us simply to disseminate our work.
So I want to open, I know that Laura had a question, and I just don't know if there's anybody else, just so that we hear them all, and then you can kind of respond and we can do that. Go for it.
Thanks, and thanks, really amazing food for thought. Again, my question was a bit linked to the one before, which is what is the role of publishers? And yes, waivers can be available, but that's always a negotiation. If we're with a big publishing house like an Elsevier or a Taylor and Francis, there have been some broad negotiations about financing models that ensure greater equity in publishing. There's a lot of thoughts on that. But I think it's also not just about the financing, there's a capacity building aspect that feels really important. And as one of those editors who has a full-time job and is not paid for editing, one of the journals that I work with has a model where we're asked to mentor junior authors, particularly from low middle-income countries, which feels like this wonderful thing to do. And it's really hard because it's really time-consuming. But we do it because it feels like the right thing to do, but it's not sustainable on a large scale. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that aspect. It's not just the financial resource, but it's a human resource that can really try and help foster that kind of equity.
Yeah, that's a great question.
And just, sorry, anybody else, because this is it, and then I'm gonna stop on the questions. Okay, brilliant, now.
Well, for people in the room, I'll be mingling after, so you can always catch me. Yeah, great question. And what was your name?
Laura.
Laura. So, yeah, I mean, all of the big journals that I work for, because they have global footprints and are really interested in globalizing, have for years, if not decades, so definitely the last 20 years of my life, have always participated in activities and initiatives to build capacity in country, in developing countries, low and middle income countries. The terminology has changed over the years. And we have a commitment, and I can tell you a very strong practice that neither ability to pay nor perfect English writing skills would ever present a barrier to publishing in those big journals. And that's mostly because we have the resources available, not like you doing it, on the airplane or just before you go to bed, but actually we spend time helping people publish in our journals because we care about it. And that's simply because those are, we have the resources to be able to do that, and I recognize not everyone has the ability to do that. When I mentioned the growth of those global health journals, which are amazing, and some of those editors are some of my closest colleagues and people I learn a hell of a lot from, almost every one of them has a dual mission, which is to publish the best research and commentary and to help contribute to building publication or writing capacity for scientists in more global countries. So I would say that in my world, I'm seeing a lot of that kind of scientific capacity building. But again, I mean, it clearly fits that framework that I'm trying to push, which is this is an ecosystem. So funders have to be investing in that. Obviously, the return on investment is enormous for funders to help all the talented young people around the world who are interested in scientific careers, invest in them early, and they will become the future health leaders. Journals, I'm going to try not to be defensive, but journals are important, and I love my job. But journals are not, they are a gatekeeper, but there is so much equal responsibility among institutions and funders. So maybe there's, maybe all of us in the room, maybe when we leave the room, we might start seeing stuff we didn't see before, which is, what is my national funder? What's my society? What's my decision-making society? What's my environmental science association? What are they doing to, that tiny piece of their contribution to the problem and therefore their responsibility to the solution, I think is really, really, really important.
I think that's a perfect place for us to end, if I may. I would just want to say, so first of all, Jocalyn, thank you. Really, thank you. And thank you to the responders very much. Thank you, and thank you to everybody here. Please join me